Right now, at this very moment, the world is running out of time. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. Literally, physically, the arteries that carry the blood of the global economy are being severed one by one, and almost nobody in the Western world is talking about what that actually means for your life, your savings, your country, and the future of civilization as we know it. In the last 10 days, something happened in the Persian Gulf that has permanently rewritten the rules of global power. And buried inside this conflict, inside the missiles and the drones and the burning tankers, is the story of one man who saw all of this coming years ago and quietly, methodically, built a plan so ambitious, so perfectly engineered, that this war may actually hand him the most dangerous economic weapon any individual has ever held in the history of the modern world. That man is Mohammed bin Salman. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the chaos unfolding in the Gulf right now is not a disaster for Saudi Arabia. It is the opportunity of a century. Stay with me, because what Iran did next in the Strait of Hormuz is going to change the world forever. But first, you need to understand how we got here, because this story did not start on February 28th, 2026. It started with a map, a pipeline, and a plan that nobody took seriously until it was already too late. To understand what is happening right now, you need to go back and look at the geography of the Gulf. Not with the eyes of a tourist or even a diplomat, but with the cold, calculating eyes of an energy strategist. Picture the Persian Gulf as a body. The heart of that body is the oil fields, the massive, almost incomprehensible reserves sitting beneath the desert sands of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, and Iran. Every single day, roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil from these nations flow through one single artery toward the rest of the world. That artery is the Strait of Hormuz. It is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. The actual shipping lane, the lane where the supertankers physically move, is just 6 miles wide, divided into two 3-mile channels, one for ships going in and one for ships going out. That is all that stands between global energy stability and a catastrophe unlike anything the modern world has experienced. And Iran sits right on top of it. On one side, you have the coast of Oman and the UAE. On the other side, you have Iran. And for decades, Iran has held this narrow corridor over the world's head like a knife, threatening to cut the artery and bleed the global economy dry. Every time tensions rose, every time sanctions tightened, Tehran would whisper the same threat: close the strait, burn the oil, starve the world of energy until the pain becomes unbearable. For decades, the world flinched. For decades, that threat was enough. But Mohammed bin Salman looked at this vulnerability and saw something nobody else saw. He did not see a problem. He saw a business opportunity. And he spent the better part of a decade building the infrastructure that would make Saudi Arabia immune to that threat, while simultaneously making the rest of the world more dependent on Riyadh than ever before. We will come back to exactly what he built, and exactly why it matters so much right now. But first, you need to understand the 10 days that changed everything. February 28th, 2026. It is a Saturday morning, and in Tehran, the streets are beginning to fill with the noise of an ordinary day. Markets opening, children heading to school. The normal, fragile, beautiful rhythm of civilian life. And then, without warning, the sky tears open. Operation Epic. Fury begins. Coordinated, simultaneous airstrikes launched by the United States, and Israel hit targets across Iran with a precision and a scale that the world has not seen since the Gulf War of 1991. The first targets are military, missile launch sites, air defense systems, command and control infrastructure, the nuclear facilities that have been a source of international anxiety for more than 2 decades. The strikes are overwhelming in their scope. Within the first few hours, American Central Command will later confirm that U.S. forces alone struck nearly 2,000 separate targets inside Iran. 2,000 targets in a single day. The sheer logistics of that operation, the planning, the coordination, the intelligence gathering that must have gone into it over months, if not years, is staggering to contemplate. But the strike that changes everything, the one that will alter the trajectory of the entire conflict and indeed of the entire geopolitical landscape of the 21st century, is the one that kills Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the man who has sat at the apex of Iranian power for nearly 4 decades, who has guided every major decision, every proxy war, every nuclear negotiation, every confrontation with the West, is gone, killed in a U.S.-Israeli airstrike on Tehran on the opening day of the war. The shockwave from that single event ripples outward in every direction simultaneously. Inside Iran, the command structure, already under enormous pressure from the relentless strikes, begins to fracture along fault lines that have existed for years but have never been fully exposed. Outside Iran, in the capitals of the Gulf states, in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Doha and Kuwait City, the phones of heads of state begin ringing simultaneously, because every one of them knows what comes next. They have known it for years. Iran does not go quietly. Iran retaliates. Within hours of the first American bombs falling on Tehran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, activates a retaliatory plan that has clearly been prepared long in advance. The scale of what comes next is almost impossible to process in real time. Iran launches a barrage of ballistic missiles and armed drones that, within the first 4 days alone, will total over 500 missiles and nearly 2,000 drones. That number is not a typo. 2,000 drones in 4 days. This is not a symbolic response. This is not a warning shot. This is a full-spectrum military operation designed to inflict maximum pain on every American ally and every American military installation across the entire region simultaneously. And the targets Iran chooses reveal the full sophistication of the strategic thinking behind this plan. Iran does not just hit Israel. Yes, Israel gets hit hard, with roughly 40% of all Iranian missile fire directed toward Israeli territory, striking civilian areas in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, killing and wounding civilians, sending the entire population of a nation into bomb shelters. But the other 60%, the majority of Iran's retaliatory fire, is aimed not at Israel but at the Gulf states, at the nations that allowed American forces to operate from their soil, at the U.S. military bases embedded in the heart of Arab territory. And this is the part of the story that the mainstream narrative almost completely misses, because what Iran did to the Gulf states in the first week of this war is not just a military story, it is an economic story, and it is the most consequential economic story of the 21st century so far. Let us go country by country through the Gulf and understand exactly what happened, because each nation's experience tells a different part of the same larger story. Start with Bahrain. This tiny island nation, connected to Saudi Arabia by a single causeway, is home to the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters, the operational nerve center of American naval power in the entire Persian Gulf region. On the opening night of the war, Iran fires a barrage of missiles directly at the 5th Fleet headquarters in Manama. Smoke rises over the Bahraini capital. The country's air defenses are pushed to their absolute limits, and even where missiles are intercepted, the debris rains down on a country that is roughly the size of a small city. Bahrain, which has no geographic depth, no room to absorb strikes, no buffer zone between its capital and its coastline, suddenly finds itself in the middle of a war it never asked for and never wanted. And it gets worse. Days into the conflict, an Iranian drone strikes a water desalination plant inside Bahrain. This is not a military target. This is the infrastructure that produces the drinking water for an entire nation. Bahrain, like many Gulf states, depends almost entirely on desalination for fresh water. Strike the desalination plant, and you're not attacking a military capability. The world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, the fuel that heats European homes in winter, that powers factories across Asia, that generates electricity for hundreds of millions of people. Qatar is also home to Al Udeid Air Base, which is the largest U.S. military installation in the entire Middle East, housing tens of thousands of American troops, and serving as the operational hub for American air power across the region. So when the war begins, Qatar finds itself in an almost impossible position. It is simultaneously a critical U.S. military platform, a massive global energy supplier, and a tiny, extraordinarily vulnerable piece of territory sitting directly in Iran's line of fire. Iran targets Qatar hard. Iranian missiles are fired at Qatar's international airport. Qatar's air defenses shoot them down. But the very act of shooting them down, the debris, the uncertainty, the insurance implications, the operational disruptions, is enough to begin unwinding Qatar's role as a global energy hub. And then comes the decision that sends shockwaves through global energy markets unlike anything seen since the oil shocks of the 1970s. Qatar, the world's largest LNG exporter, halts gas production entirely on March 2nd, 2026, 4 days into the war, and on March 4th, Qatar declares force majeure on its gas contracts. Force majeure is the legal term that means an act of God, an event so extraordinary and unforeseeable that a company or a nation cannot be held to its contractual obligations. Qatar is telling every gas buyer on the planet, every utility company in Europe, every industrial complex in Asia, every nation that depends on Qatari LNG to keep its lights on and its factories running, that it cannot deliver. Qatar's energy minister goes further. He issues a public warning that if the war continues, other Gulf energy producers may be forced to do the same. His exact words are stark and unambiguous. He says this will bring down economies of the world. Let that sentence sit for a moment. The energy minister of one of the world's most sophisticated and wealthy nations, a man with every incentive in the world to project calm and stability, is publicly warning that the global economy faces collapse if this conflict does not stop. That is not rhetoric. That is a man who can see the data in real time and is telling you exactly what it means. Now move to Kuwait. Kuwait is another U.S. ally, another host of American military forces, another Gulf state that finds itself suddenly on the front line of a war between great powers. Iran strikes U.S. facilities in Kuwait. The U.S. embassy in Kuwait is hit and closed indefinitely. Iranian drones and missiles strike Kuwaiti oil fields. And here is where the economic numbers start to become genuinely terrifying. Kuwait, before the war, was producing its normal quota of oil. Within days of the conflict beginning, that production begins to crater under the pressure of strikes, infrastructure damage, and the simple reality that tankers cannot safely reach Kuwaiti ports when the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed. Kuwait joins Iraq in slashing output, and Iraq, which before the war was producing approximately 3 million barrels of oil per day, the second largest output in OPEC, sees its production collapse to just 3 million barrels per day within the first week of the conflict, a reduction of 70% in a single week. To put that in perspective, that is 3 million barrels per day of Iraqi oil that simply disappears from global supply. Every single day. That is the equivalent of an entire Saudi Arabia's worth of production, just from Iraq alone, vanishing overnight. Now move to the United Arab Emirates. The UAE is in many ways the most economically significant of all the Gulf states targeted by Iran in this conflict. Dubai is the financial capital of the Arab world, the hub through which vast quantities of international trade and investment flow. Abu Dhabi is one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds and one of its most important oil producers. The UAE was producing roughly 3 million barrels of oil per day before the war. And the UAE, perhaps more than any other Gulf state, built its entire economic model on the assumption of stability, on being the safe, reliable, modern, cosmopolitan alternative to the volatile politics of the region. That model is now being stress-tested in real time at the worst possible moment. Iranian missiles and drones strike Abu Dhabi airport. They strike landmark sites. They strike infrastructure in the industrial zone of Fujairah, the UAE's key oil export terminal located outside the Strait of Hormuz on the Gulf of Oman coast. 3 people are killed. 112 are wounded. The UAE government's air defenses respond furiously, shooting down ballistic missiles with interceptors while fighter jets chase drones through the night sky over one of the world's most glamorous cities. The images coming out of Dubai and Abu Dhabi are surreal. Missile streaks in the sky over skyscrapers, air defense explosions lighting up the darkness above the Burj Khalifa, emergency alerts on the phones of the millions of expatriates who moved to the UAE precisely because it seemed like the one place in the Middle East where none of this could ever happen. And now Saudi Arabia. This is where the story becomes most consequential, most complex, and, for Mohammed bin Salman, most revealing of a strategic vision that is, depending on your perspective, either brilliantly prescient or chillingly calculating. The Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs confirms that Iranian attacks targeted both Riyadh, the capital, and the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. The eastern province is not just a geographical designation, it is the heartland of Saudi oil production. It is where Aramco, the world's largest oil company, operates its most critical infrastructure. It is where the King Abdulaziz Air Base, a key hub for U.S. and Saudi air operations, is located. It is the economic engine room of the entire Saudi state, and indeed of much of the global economy. Iran hits it, or tries to. And here is where something extraordinary happens. Despite being targeted, despite being directly in the line of fire of Iranian missiles and drones, Saudi Arabia's oil production does not significantly collapse. Its air defenses hold. Its infrastructure sustains damage, but the critical systems keep running. And Mohammed bin Salman, watching his country absorb Iranian strikes while his oil continues to flow, is presented with an economic opportunity that his entire decade-long master plan was designed to exploit. We will come to exactly what that master plan looks like, and exactly what it means for the global economy, very shortly. But first, you need to understand the single most important development of this entire conflict, the one that changed the rules of the global economy overnight, what Iran did to the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide, 6 miles of actual shipping lane. The most important piece of water on the surface of the earth when measured by the economic value of what flows through it. Every day in normal times, approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil pass through this channel. That is roughly 20% of all the oil consumed by the entire planet every single day, moving through a corridor that is physically narrower than the distance from one end of a city to the other. 17% of all the world's liquefied natural gas also moves through the strait, including the gas that heats European homes, powers Asian factories, and keeps electricity flowing to hundreds of millions of people. The total value of the energy commodities transiting the Strait of Hormuz in a single year exceeds $500 billion, $500 billion, every year, through 21 miles of water. And Iran sits on one side of it. On February 28, 2026, the same day Operation Epic Fury begins, the IRGC broadcasts a message on the maritime very high frequency radio channels that every vessel in the region monitors. The message is simple and devastating. No ship is allowed to pass the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC does not just make this announcement, it backs it up with action. Oil tankers are struck near the strait. Iranian drones and missiles hit vessels in the Gulf of Oman. A Malta-flagged oil tanker is struck. A Palau-flagged tanker is hit off the coast of Oman and set ablaze. A tugboat sent to help a stricken vessel is itself struck by 2 missiles and sinks. The message could not be clearer. The IRGC is not just making threats, it is killing ships. And the global maritime industry, which has seen the Red Sea disruption of 2024 and 2025, and knows exactly what happens to insurance premiums and shipping routes when a major waterway becomes dangerous, responds immediately and decisively. Maersk, the world's largest container shipping company, suspends Hormuz transit. CMA CGM follows. Hapag-Lloyd follows. Every major shipping firm in the world pulls its vessels out of the strait simultaneously. The tanker tracking data tells the story in stark numerical terms. Within days, approximately 150 freight ships, including dozens of oil tankers, are anchored outside the strait, sitting motionless in open water, waiting for a signal that it is safe to move. That signal does not come. By the first week of March, maritime analysts are describing the situation in terms that would have seemed apocalyptic a month earlier. Tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has dropped from its normal 20 million barrels per day to something approaching zero. Zero. The artery of the global economy has been severed. Now let us talk about the money, because this is where the story stops being about missiles and starts being about something that affects every single person watching this video, regardless of where you live, regardless of your political beliefs, regardless of whether you have ever thought about the Middle East in your life. When the Strait of Hormuz closes, oil prices do not just rise, they explode. In the days following the opening of the conflict, U.S. crude oil surges past $91 per barrel. Brent crude, the global benchmark that determines the price of everything from jet fuel to plastic packaging to fertilizer, blows through $92. For context, just days before the war began, Brent was trading around $73. That is a roughly 26% price increase in less than 2 weeks. And it is not just the headline oil price that matters. The ripple effects through the global economy are immediate and cascading in every direction. Insurance premiums for vessels transiting the Gulf have risen from a fraction of a percent of vessel value to multiple percentage points per transit. An increase that for a very large crude carrier translates into hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional cost per voyage before the vessel has moved a single mile. Those costs get passed on to refiners. Refiners pass them to fuel distributors pass them to airlines, trucking companies, heating oil suppliers, and every business in the world that depends on transport. Those businesses pass the costs to consumers. The average price of gasoline in the United States jumps to over $3.46 per gallon within a week, up from $2.94. That is a 17% increase at the gas pump for ordinary American families in under 2 weeks. In Europe, where energy dependency on the Gulf is even more acute, the numbers are worse. In Asia, where nations like China, India, Japan, and South Korea collectively account for nearly 70% of all the crude oil that normally flows through the strait, the economic exposure is existential. Japan's refiners, who source 95% of their crude oil from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar, and who ship 70% of that oil through the Strait of Hormuz, are already requesting government access to emergency strategic reserves. South Korean energy companies are doing the same. Chinese and Indian policymakers are watching the situation with an alarm that their official statements barely begin to convey, because both nations know that their industrial economies, their manufacturing sectors, their power grids, their entire economic growth models are built on the assumption of reliable, affordable Gulf energy. Take away that assumption, and you're not talking about higher gas prices. You're talking about factory shutdowns, inflation spirals, currency crises, sovereign debt stress, the kind of economic shocks that topple governments and rewrite the political maps of entire regions. And this is all happening simultaneously, in real time, while the missiles are still flying. There's a critical detail in the economic story that most analysts are missing entirely. It concerns the asymmetry of pain that this crisis creates between different players. On one side, you have the nations that depend on Gulf energy flowing smoothly through the Strait of Hormuz. Japan, South Korea, China, India, most of Europe. These nations are bleeding in real time. Their energy costs are spiking. Their current account deficits are exploding. Their central banks are being forced to make extremely difficult decisions about interest rates and currency interventions at exactly the moment when their economies are already under pressure from a decade of post-pandemic disruption, inflation cycles, and slowing growth. These nations have essentially no good options. They cannot easily replace Gulf oil in the short term. The alternative routes, Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline, the UAE's Fujairah pipeline, can between them handle perhaps 17% of the volume that normally flows through the strait. That means even in the best-case scenario, even if every alternative pipeline and export terminal runs at maximum capacity 24 hours a day, roughly 83% of the normal Strait of Hormuz traffic has nowhere to go. The oil is in the ground or in storage, but it cannot get to the buyers who need it. And every day that passes, every day that oil does not flow, the economic pressure on consuming nations ratchets upward in a way that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. Now look at the other side of the ledger. Look at the nations that produce oil but are not entirely dependent on straight transit to move it. Look specifically at Saudi Arabia. And here is where Mohammed bin Salman's decade-long Masterplan reveals its full, astonishing scope. Because MBS did not just build pipelines, he built a strategic moat. He built a wall between Saudi Arabia's oil production capacity and the Iranian chokehold over the strait. And he did it quietly, methodically, over years, while the rest of the world was focused on other things. To understand the master plan, you need to understand the geography of Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure, because geography is the foundation of everything that follows. Saudi Arabia's oil fields are in the eastern province, the same region that Iran just targeted with missiles. The oil flows from these fields through pipelines to export terminals. And historically, the primary export terminals, the places where the oil gets loaded onto supertankers, were all on the Gulf Coast, inside the Persian Gulf, east of the Strait of Hormuz, which means that, historically, Saudi oil exports were just as vulnerable to an Iranian closure of the strait as everyone else's. If Iran closed the strait, Saudi Arabia could not export. Full stop. That vulnerability was the original leverage point. That was what gave Iran its strategic card in every confrontation. But somewhere in the second decade of the 21st century, under MBS's direction and with the full weight of Saudi Aramco's engineering capabilities behind it, the kingdom made a different choice. It invested massively in expanding the capacity of the East-West pipeline, also known as the Petroline, which runs from the oil fields in the eastern province all the way across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea coast, terminating at the port of Yanbu on the opposite side of Saudi Arabia from the Strait of Hormuz. This pipeline has a designed capacity of approximately 7 million barrels of oil per day. 7 million. That is more than the entire normal output of Iraq and Kuwait combined. It is a pipeline capable, in theory, of routing most of Saudi Arabia's oil production entirely around the Strait of Hormuz, bypassing the Iranian chokehold entirely, and delivering Saudi crude directly into the Red Sea, from which it can reach European and Asian markets without ever entering the Persian Gulf. And then MBS went further. He built up Yanbu, the Red Sea export terminal, into one of the most sophisticated and high-capacity oil export facilities in the world. He invested in the downstream infrastructure, the loading capacity, the storage terminals, the refining capabilities that would allow Yanbu to absorb a massive surge in export volumes on short notice. And he coordinated with the UAE on the Fujairah pipeline and terminal on the Gulf of Oman coast, which bypasses the strait from the UAE side, creating a second alternative export route that, together with the Saudi East-West pipeline, gives the Gulf's two most critical producers a genuine operational ability to export significant volumes of oil, even if the strait is completely closed. This is not a plan that was drawn up after the conflict began. This is infrastructure that was built over years at enormous cost, precisely in anticipation of this moment. And now that moment has arrived. But here's the part of the story that reveals the true depth of MBS's strategic thinking, and the part that makes this crisis simultaneously terrifying for the world and potentially transformative for Saudi Arabia's geopolitical position. Because the East-West pipeline and the Yanbu terminal are not, by themselves, enough to replace the full volume of Gulf oil that normally moves through the strait. Saudi Arabia's alternative export routes can handle perhaps 7 to 8 million barrels per day in optimal conditions. The strait normally moves 20 million, so even with every Saudi alternative pipeline running at maximum capacity, there is still a 12 million barrel per day gap between what the world needs and what can actually be delivered. That gap is what makes oil prices spike. That gap is what creates the economic pain felt by every nation in the world that depends on imported energy. And it is in that gap, in that 12 million barrel shortfall, that Mohammed bin Salman holds an extraordinary and unprecedented form of leverage. Because Saudi Arabia is not just a producer. It is the producer, it is the nation that sits on top of the world's largest proved oil reserves, that maintains the largest spare production capacity of any country in OPEC. And that has spent the last decade quietly building the infrastructure to turn that reserve capacity into actual exports through routes that Iran cannot threaten. When the world is desperate for oil and the strait is closed and Qatar is declaring force majeure and Iraq's production has collapsed by 70% and Kuwait is struggling, Saudi Arabia becomes the only game in town. It becomes the one nation on earth that can actually increase oil supply to a market screaming for relief. And it can do so through routes that bypass the Iranian blockade entirely, delivering oil via the Red Sea and the Gulf of Oman while the rest of the Gulf is paralyzed. That is not just economic power. That is the kind of leverage that allows you to reshape geopolitical relationships, to demand concessions, to extract agreements, to position your nation as the indispensable partner of every major power on earth simultaneously, from the United States to China to Europe to India, all of whom need Saudi oil and all of whom will pay, financially and diplomatically, for reliable access to it. And there is a second layer to the Masterplan that goes beyond the pipelines. MBS understood something that most Western analysts completely missed in their focus on Iran's nuclear program and the region's military confrontations. He understood that the transition away from fossil fuels, the global energy transition being pushed by Western governments and climate advocates, is not actually going to happen as quickly as its proponents believe. Not because the technology is not advancing, although in many sectors it is advancing more slowly than hoped, but because the sheer scale of infrastructure replacement required is staggering, and because developing nations across Asia and Africa and Latin America have legitimate energy poverty problems that cannot be solved with solar panels and wind turbines alone, at least not in the near term. MBS looked at the timeline of the global energy transition and concluded that oil demand is not going to fall as sharply as the International Energy Agency predicted, that Saudi oil is going to remain essential to the global economy for decades to come, and that the critical strategic question is not how to phase out Saudi oil gracefully, but how to ensure that Saudi oil remains indispensable and that Riyadh captures the maximum possible value from its reserves before the transition does eventually arrive. That is why Saudi Arabia has been investing not just in pipelines and export terminals, but in downstream capacity, in petrochemicals, in refining, in the kind of vertically integrated energy infrastructure that allows Riyadh to capture value, not just from selling crude, but from selling finished products, plastics, fertilizers, jet fuel, lubricants, the entire downstream chain of the petroleum industry. And it is why Saudi Arabia has been simultaneously developing, through NEOM and its Vision 2030 program, the economic diversification that will sustain the kingdom even after the oil era eventually ends. MBS is not just managing an oil company, he is managing the transition of an entire civilization from one economic model to another. And he has been doing it while simultaneously ensuring that the old model, the oil model, delivers maximum strategic leverage during the transition period. The crisis in the Strait of Hormuz is not a disruption to his plan. It is, in a deeply uncomfortable way, a validation of it. Now let us look at the broader economic picture with the full clarity that it demands. Because what is happening in the global economy right now, as missiles fly over Gulf oil fields and tankers sit motionless outside the strait, is not just a temporary energy price spike, it is a potential restructuring of the entire global economic order. Consider first what is happening to global inflation. Before this conflict, central banks around the world had spent 2 years fighting post-pandemic inflation and had, in most cases, largely succeeded. Interest rates had been raised, price pressures had eased, and the global economy was beginning, cautiously, to stabilize. Now, in a single week, a 20% surge in oil prices threatens to reignite inflationary pressures across every economy on Earth simultaneously. Energy costs flow through the entire economy. They raise the cost of manufacturing because factories need power. They raise the cost of transportation because trucks and ships and planes need fuel. They raise the cost of food because agriculture is intensely energy dependent. From the natural gas used to make fertilizer, to the diesel that powers farm equipment, to the fuel that moves food products from fields to stores. A sustained oil price spike of the magnitude being driven by the Hormuz crisis does not just raise your gas bill. It raises the cost of everything you buy. Everything. And it does so at a moment when the purchasing power of ordinary workers in most developed economies is already stretched thin after years of post-pandemic inflation. The political consequences of that economic pressure are enormous and unpredictable. Consider next what is happening to global financial markets. Stock markets do not like uncertainty. They like predictability, stability, clear earnings projections, and reliable macroeconomic conditions. What they are getting right now is the exact opposite. Every major equity market on the planet is trying simultaneously to price the risks of a sustained Strait of Hormuz closure, a potential ground war in the Middle East involving U.S. forces, cascading supply chain disruptions, inflation resurgence, central bank policy pivots, and sovereign debt stress in energy importing nations. Energy company stocks are surging as their revenues spike with oil prices. Everything else is falling. Airlines are being destroyed by fuel cost increases. Petrochemical companies and manufacturers that depend on petroleum feedstocks are facing margin compression. Logistics companies are grappling with insurance costs and route changes. The financial sector is watching its loan books for exposure to energy importing economies that are suddenly facing much more severe fiscal stress. The center of gravity in global financial markets is shifting in real time, and the direction of that shift runs directly toward the energy producers with geographic good fortune and strategic infrastructure, which means, above all, toward Riyadh. Consider also what is happening to Russia's strategic position. This is one of the most overlooked dimensions of the current crisis. Russia is an enormous oil and gas producer. Before this conflict, Russia's oil exports were under severe pressure from Western sanctions imposed following the invasion of Ukraine. Russian crude was trading at a discount to global benchmarks. Its markets had been partially redirected from Europe to Asia, and its revenues, while substantial, were lower than they would have been in an unsanctioned market. Now, with Gulf oil suddenly inaccessible and Strait of Hormuz transit shut down, the world's desperate need for alternative energy sources is inevitably going to ease pressure on Russia. India, which has already been buying discounted Russian crude since the Ukraine sanctions regime began, faces an acute near-term energy exposure from the Gulf crisis, and will almost certainly deepen its Russian oil purchases immediately. China, which had been moderating its intake of Russian crude for various diplomatic and commercial reasons, will almost certainly abandon that restraint as the Gulf disruption extends. Europe, which has spent years trying to wean itself off Russian gas, now finds itself facing simultaneous disruptions from both the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea, meaning its LNG import options are severely constrained and its winter energy security is genuinely at risk. The crisis in the Gulf is not just a crisis for the Gulf, it is a crisis that reverberates across every energy market on the planet, strengthening the positions of producers outside the conflict zone, while devastating the economies of nations that depend on affordable, reliable energy to sustain their growth models. And now let us come back to Mohammed bin Salman and the moment that his decade of strategic preparation has been building toward. Because in the middle of this extraordinary crisis, as oil prices surge and tankers sit motionless and the global economy teeters, Saudi Arabia is in a position that no other nation on earth occupies. It is a major oil producer with both the physical infrastructure to export through alternative routes and the spare production capacity to potentially increase output at the precise moment when the market is most desperate for additional supply. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline can move somewhere between 5 and 7 million barrels per day to the Red Sea terminal at Yanbu. Saudi Aramco has spare production capacity, the ability to produce more oil than it is currently producing, estimated at somewhere between 2 and 3 million barrels per day. In theory, Saudi Arabia could redirect existing production through the pipeline while simultaneously cranking up total output to fill some of the gap created by Iraqi and Kuwaiti production collapses and Qatari LNG shutdowns. Every barrel of Saudi oil that moves through Yanbu to a desperate global market moves at a price that is being driven upward by the very crisis that is making it possible to move outside the strait. Saudi Arabia is in the extraordinary position of being able to sell more oil at higher prices through routes that are currently unaffected by the conflict, precisely because the conflict has eliminated most of its competition for the role of the world's swing producer. The revenue implications for Saudi Arabia are staggering. The diplomatic implications are equally profound. Every nation in the world that is suffering from the energy shock of this crisis, every government in Europe, every energy ministry in Asia, every corporation in the world that needs oil to keep its operations running, is going to come to Riyadh. They are going to come asking for Saudi oil, on Saudi terms, through Saudi pipelines, under whatever conditions Mohammed bin Salman chooses to set. And MBS, who has spent a decade building exactly this moment, is not going to waste it. This is the Masterplan in its full expression. Not a plan to start a war. To be absolutely clear, Saudi Arabia has no obvious interest in a regional conflict that targets its own infrastructure and puts its own population at risk, but a plan to ensure that if a conflict did come, if the Strait of Hormuz did close, if the region did descend into the kind of upheaval that regional analysts have been warning about for years, Saudi Arabia would be positioned not as a victim of that upheaval, but as its primary economic beneficiary. MBS spent years being underestimated. He was dismissed as a reckless young prince when he ordered the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi and triggered an international crisis. He was mocked as naive when he announced his Vision 2030 diversification plan and promised to transform Saudi Arabia from an oil-dependent monarchy into a modern, diversified economy. He was criticized as destabilizing when he launched aggressive military operations in Yemen and a blockade of Qatar. And he was dismissed as a dreamer when he spent billions on NEOM and other megaprojects that seemed disconnected from Saudi Arabia's immediate geopolitical challenges. But every one of those moves, viewed through the lens of what is happening right now in the Gulf, looks different. The Yemen war, whatever its humanitarian costs, was in part about preventing Iranian-backed Houthi forces from establishing a position that could threaten Saudi Arabia's Red Sea coastline and its most critical alternative export route. The Qatar blockade, which ended in reconciliation in 2021, was part of a broader struggle for Gulf leadership that MBS ultimately won on his terms. The Vision 2030 investments were building the non-oil economy that Saudi Arabia needs to survive after oil, while the oil economy was simultaneously being maximized. And the pipeline and export infrastructure investments were building exactly the geographic insulation that Saudi Arabia now needs in this precise moment of crisis. But here's the question that nobody in global capitals is willing to answer publicly, because the answer is too uncomfortable. What does Mohammed bin Salman want in exchange for opening Saudi Arabia's full production capacity to a world desperate for oil? Because nothing in geopolitics comes free. Saudi Arabia is not going to pump an extra 2 million barrels per day through the East-West pipeline and deliver it to desperate Asian and European buyers out of the goodness of its heart. It is going to extract payment, not just in money, although the money will be extraordinary. It will extract payment in diplomatic recognition, in security guarantees, in technology transfers, in the normalization of Saudi Arabia's position as a legitimate and indispensable partner of every major power simultaneously. It will extract payment in the form of the United States' implicit acceptance of Saudi Arabia's nuclear ambitions, the civilian nuclear program that Riyadh has been quietly developing and that Washington has been nervously monitoring. It will extract payment in the form of Chinese diplomatic alignment and investment commitments. It will extract payment in the form of European acquiescence to Saudi foreign policy goals across the Arab world. This is the true prize that the Masterplan was designed to deliver. Not just higher oil prices, not just more revenue, but the transformation of Saudi Arabia from a regional power dependent on American security guarantees into a genuinely global power, one that can play Washington and Beijing and Brussels against each other in a game whose fundamental rules are set in Riyadh. And now we arrive at the final and most critical question, the one that determines whether what we are living through right now is a terrible but ultimately contained regional crisis or something genuinely unprecedented in the history of the modern world. What happens if this conflict does not end? What happens if the United States and Israel cannot achieve the regime change in Iran that they are explicitly seeking? And what happens if the Iranian state, wounded, decapitated under relentless military pressure, nevertheless refuses to collapse? What happens if the IRGC, which has a deeply embedded, decentralized command structure specifically designed to survive exactly this kind of targeted killing campaign, keeps the missiles flying and the drones moving and the strait effectively closed for not 1 week or 2 weeks, but 1 month, 2 months, 3 months? The economic models are stark in their implications. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated the cost of just the first 100 hours of Operation Epic Fury at $3.7 billion, approximately $900 million per day. That is the direct military cost to the United States alone. Add to that the indirect economic costs, the oil price spike flowing through the global economy, the shipping disruption, the supply chain pressure, the inflation reignition, and you are looking at an economic event that dwarfs anything the world has seen since the 2008 financial crisis. The International Monetary Fund has already been warning for months that the global economy is dangerously fragile. A sustained Strait of Hormuz closure, according to energy economists, would add somewhere between 20 and 40% to global oil prices in the short term, with knock-on effects that could trigger recession in virtually every major economy that is a net energy importer. Europe, Japan, South Korea, India, and dozens of smaller economies face the real prospect of negative growth, spiking unemployment, and the kind of social and political instability that historically precedes much larger geopolitical ruptures. This is not a distant theoretical risk. It is the direct, foreseeable, mathematically predictable consequence of the current trajectory, if the conflict is not resolved and the strait does not reopen. And the military dimension of the question is equally fraught. Trump has demanded Iran's unconditional surrender. Ali Larijani, the head of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, has responded by warning that Iranian forces are waiting for a potential U.S. ground invasion and threatening that American troops who enter Iranian territory will be killed and captured by the thousands. This is not idle rhetoric. Iran has a population of nearly 90 million people, a deeply nationalistic culture, a military establishment that has been preparing for exactly this conflict for decades, and a geographic terrain that has historically made invasion extraordinarily costly for any military force, including the greatest military powers in history. The United States learned in Afghanistan and Iraq the brutal arithmetic of occupying a country whose population, or a significant portion of it, is mobilized to resist. Iran is larger than Afghanistan and Iraq combined. It has a more sophisticated military capability. It has battle-hardened commanders who have spent years fighting and advising proxy forces across the entire Middle East. And it has a domestic legitimacy argument that the U.S.-Israeli strikes, by killing civilians, by striking schools and hospitals, by targeting a water desalination plant that is essential for civilian life, have now dramatically strengthened. The Iranian people who were protesting the regime in January are now, at least in significant numbers, rallying in defense of their country under attack. That is the paradox of this kind of military operation. The harder you hit, the more you risk creating the nationalist cohesion you are trying to destroy. The world is at a moment of genuine historical bifurcation. There are paths from here that lead to a relatively rapid ceasefire, a diplomatic process that de-escalates the military confrontation, reopens the Strait of Hormuz, stabilizes oil markets, and allows the world economy to recover, scarred but intact, from the shock of the last several weeks. Those paths exist. Diplomats are working on them. The European Union, China, and several other powers are pushing hard for de-escalation. There are reports of back-channel communications, of conditional proposals, of the kinds of quiet conversations that sometimes, in the history of conflicts, manage to pull the world back from the edge before it goes over. And there are paths from here that lead somewhere much darker. A ground war in Iran, a multi-year occupation, an Iranian nuclear breakout in the chaos of regime change, a scenario that military planners regard as the nightmare of all nightmares, a complete and sustained closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a global recession triggered by the energy shock, a fracturing of the post-World War II security architecture as nations recalculate their alliances in the face of a United States that has demonstrated its willingness to launch full-scale war in pursuit of regime change. Which path the world takes depends on decisions being made right now, in the next days and weeks, in Washington and Tel Aviv and Tehran and Riyadh and Beijing and the corridors of the United Nations. What is not in doubt is that the world that emerges from this crisis, whatever form it takes, will be fundamentally different from the world that existed on February 27, 2026, the day before the first bombs fell on Tehran. The geography of global power has shifted. The map of energy security has been redrawn. And sitting at the center of the redrawn map, holding the key to the artery that the rest of the world most desperately needs to reopen, or to keep flowing through alternative routes if the strait remains closed, is Mohammed bin Salman. Whether that is the result of brilliant strategic foresight or simply the extraordinary good fortune of a man whose decade-long infrastructure investments happen to align perfectly with the worst regional crisis in a generation, the practical effect is the same. Saudi Arabia is now the indispensable nation, the one country that every major power on earth must deal with, on Saudi terms, in order to stabilize the global economy and prevent an energy catastrophe from becoming something even worse. The Masterplan may have been drawn on paper in Riyadh years ago, measured in barrels and pipelines and export terminal capacity, but it is being written in fire right now, across the burning waters of the Persian Gulf and the silent, motionless ships anchored outside the Strait of Hormuz. And the story is far from over. What happens next will determine not just the fate of Iran, not just the outcome of the U.S.-Israel military campaign, but the structure of the global energy order for the next generation. Keep watching, keep paying attention, because the decisions being made in the next 30 days will reverberate for 30 years. And the one man who has spent a decade making sure that when the world finally needed him most, he would be impossible to ignore, is watching all of it unfold from Riyadh, with a map in one hand and a pipeline route in the other. There is one more dimension to this story that demands to be told, and it is perhaps the most important of all for understanding the true magnitude of what is unfolding. It concerns the relationship between Saudi Arabia and China, and why that relationship is now at the center of the most consequential geopolitical realignment of the 21st century. For decades, the global oil market operated on a set of rules that were established after World War II and reinforced at every crisis since. Oil is priced in US dollars. Nations that want to buy oil must hold dollar reserves. The United States provides security for the Gulf states. It is the reason that the United States can run persistent trade deficits without triggering a currency crisis. It is the reason that American interest rates are lower than they would otherwise be. It is, in a very real sense, one of the primary mechanisms through which the United States maintains its extraordinary economic advantage over every other nation on earth. And Mohammed bin Salman has been quietly, carefully, and methodically exploring what happens if Saudi Arabia stops following those rules. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran, with Chinese mediation, reached a surprise diplomatic normalization agreement that shocked Western analysts. In 2024, Saudi Arabia was formally invited to join BRICS, the geopolitical grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa that represents the most significant formal challenge to Western-led international institutions in the post-Cold War era. In the months before this conflict, Saudi Arabia and China had been in advanced discussions about conducting at least a portion of Saudi oil sales in Chinese yuan, rather than exclusively in US dollars. The implications of that shift, if it had gone through fully and publicly, would have been seismic for global financial markets and for the foundations of American economic power. Now, with the U.S. engaged in a full-scale war in Iran, with American credibility in the Gulf under scrutiny, with Gulf states bearing the costs of hosting American military infrastructure in the form of Iranian retaliation, the calculus around the petrodollar system is shifting further. Saudi Arabia cannot abandon U.S. security cooperation overnight because it still needs American military technology and intelligence to defend its own territory. But it can and will use this moment of maximum American need for Saudi oil cooperation to extract specific, tangible concessions that move the kingdom further toward the multipolar energy order that MBS has been building toward for years. The price of Saudi oil stabilization will be paid partly in money, partly in diplomatic recognition, and partly in the slow, structural unwinding of arrangements that have underpinned American global economic dominance for 50 years. China's role in all of this is worth examining with particular care. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. It imports approximately 10 to 11 million barrels per day, of which roughly 70% historically comes from the Gulf region through the Strait of Hormuz. The Hormuz crisis is, in material terms, a direct threat to China's industrial economy, to its manufacturing sector, to the energy security of its population, and to the political stability of the Communist Party government, which has staked its legitimacy on delivering consistent economic growth. China cannot allow a sustained strait closure to strangle its oil imports. It will use every diplomatic and economic lever at its disposal to try to de-escalate the crisis. It has already been in contact with both Iranian and American officials, offering itself as a potential mediator, as it did in brokering the Iran-Saudi normalization of 2023. But China also has a second track. It has been developing oil import alternatives for exactly this scenario. China has been building strategic petroleum reserves for years. It has been investing in pipeline routes that bring Central Asian and Russian oil to Chinese consumers without passing anywhere near the Strait of Hormuz, and it has been cultivating its relationship with Saudi Arabia with extraordinary care and patience, knowing that in a crisis scenario, Saudi Arabia's ability to move oil through the East-West pipeline and the Red Sea route creates a delivery path for Saudi crude to Asian markets that bypasses the strait entirely. A Saudi-China oil supply agreement negotiated in the shadow of the Hormuz crisis, denominated partly in yuan, secured with Chinese diplomatic support for Saudi security, and underpinned by Saudi pipeline infrastructure that China helped finance, would represent the single largest geopolitical realignment in the global energy order since the original petrodollar agreements of the 1970s. And MBS knows it. He has been preparing for this conversation for years. He is having it now. The final piece of this extraordinary story is what it means for the ordinary people of the world, for the billions of human beings who have no pipeline investments, no oil reserves, no geopolitical leverage of any kind, but who will nonetheless live with the consequences of these decisions for decades to come. In the developing world, where food security is already fragile and energy poverty is widespread, the consequences of a sustained oil price spike are not abstract. They are measured in hunger, in heat without electricity, in children who cannot go to school because their parents cannot afford transport, in small businesses that cannot survive the sudden spike in their energy costs. The economic pain of an energy crisis is not distributed equally. It falls hardest and most cruelly on the people who were already most vulnerable, who have the fewest resources to absorb the shock, and who had the least say in the decisions that created the crisis in the first place. Every day that the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed, every day that Qatar's LNG exports remain suspended, every day that Iraqi oil production stays 70% below its pre-war level, the humanitarian cost of this conflict grows in ways that never make the headlines, that never get counted in the official casualty figures, but that are as real and as devastating as any missile strike. This is what happens when great powers play great power games and ordinary people pay the price. This is what happens when geography meets strategy, meets military force, and the result is that the artery of the global economy gets severed. The world is not broken, not yet. The strait could reopen. Diplomacy could find a path. The missiles could stop flying. The tankers could start moving again. But every day that passes without resolution makes the path back to stability longer, steeper, and more costly. And every day that passes without resolution also deepens the structural changes that MBS is engineering, moves Saudi Arabia further toward the position of indispensable global energy guarantor, and shifts the balance of global power in ways that will not be easily reversed even after the shooting stops. This is the Masterplan. This is the geography of total control. And it is unfolding right now, in real time, with consequences that none of us can fully see yet, but all of us will eventually feel.